Almost 230,000. Still running like a champ. Can't believe it after 22 years of ownership. Here's a little tour of my 99 Mustang. It is a V6 car, but I use this for autocross and car shows. I've had this car for about 22 years. I've had it since 2001. I had 20,000 miles when I bought it, and now it's got just under 230,000 miles and still going pretty good. Positive thing about having the V6, that 3.8, is it has proven itself to be very reliable. I haven't had any issues with the engine itself. I mean, once in a while I've had sensor troubles or something like that, but as far as mechanical side of things, works great. And I've since, in the past few years, turned it into an autocross car. I've added some of this aero styling in the past year. I put on some pretty good meats for autocross, and these tires are pretty good just for street and just driving straight to the autocross track and letting it rip. I've got a few suspension goodies, like that big bar there. That's my Panhard bar. If I can get under the car, there's you'll see my part of my exhaust, but then you'll see the torque arm coming off the diff, and then it'll go all the way up, halfway up the car. That replaces my upper control arms. Since I lowered this car about, I say this is lowered about 2 inches or so, there is minimal ground clearance. The main problem being, if we can get into there, the exhaust, you'll see the catalytic converter. It's about, gosh, I don't think it's even 3 inches off the ground, so I got to be extremely careful. Not to mention, there's more exhaust connections right there that are pretty low, so if there's a rock on the road, I'm kind of screwed. So I got to be extra careful about how I drive this on the street. About 10 years ago, in 2010, 2011, I had this repainted. It was just a plain white, now it's a pearl white. It's a pretty nice color. The body shop did a phenomenal job. Holding up really well. Really happy with it. Well, let's take this thing for a little rip. Well, before we hop inside, here's the under hood of the 3.8 liter engine anyway. This looks a little different from what you typically see on a V6, namely this upper intake manifold. On a stock V6, it'll have a cast aluminum intake where it is split port like this. You'll have a long runner and a short runner for each cylinder. These go across to the opposite bank. Well, the long one does. The short one goes back to the bank down that same side. This manifold came off of actually a mid to late 90s Ford Windstar minivan that uses a 3.8. These are tuned to give a little more low-end torque, probably to pull the fat weight of the Ford Windstar minivan around a little bit better, but they work great on these Mustangs too. Not to mention they look better. The stock intake is cast aluminum, is kind of flipped backwards from this, and where the manifold collects in the back, it'll kind of fold over itself, come over here, and then you'll have the intake tubing right here. This allows for a little smoother flow in this configuration, and on my particular setup with this intake, I'll have I added a GT throttle body. I think these are 65 millimeter compared to the stock V6, which is a 56 millimeter, if I remember right. I had to do a custom intake setup because obviously with the stock setup, with the intake being over here, I can't use that tubing. So I have this tube and an open air filter, but I really need to put that into the fender well because this collects a lot of hot air when it's sitting and idling, but it does pretty good. When I'm out cruising, it's not really that big of a deal. All right, let's go for a drive. It's kind of a small car to get into for someone my size. I am 6 foot 6 inches tall, so my legs are struggling, but I make do. right. This car came with a 5-speed manual, and in the New Edge V6s, they're a Tremec T5, and it's the same transmission they would have used in the earlier 94, 95 GTs. Well, they just carried it over and kept it with the V6 models. All right, let's go for a little spin. You're gonna hear a lot of noises in this car. All the suspension on this car is not stock. I have this thing on coilovers front and back. I got a whine in the rear end. I put an 8.8 in there and I set up the gears myself. I know I have the backlash dialed in really well, but I think I shimmed the pinion gear out a little too far, and it makes just an awful howl. Just cruising along at light loads, about 40 miles an hour or so, something like that. That's all right. I don't drive this car every day, so it doesn't bother me too much. It might really, might be prominent during the video when I'm just cruising. And this T5 is actually a transmission built by a company called G-Force. It's pretty much the stock T5 case with some beefier gears, and then I have a taller first gear, making first through fourth gear close ratio, which is handy for my drag racing and my autocrossing. And at the same time, having a really tall overdrive in it, where that'll keep my RPMs pretty much exactly the same as stock when I'm cruising on the interstate, to keep my fuel mileage up. Because in the rear end, not only did I put that bigger 8.8 in out of a GT, I geared it down from a stock 327 gear set to a 373, which that in itself is a great performance adder, especially for the V6 engine. Makes a world of difference. That gear ratio will give GTs in this era, they'll give them a run for their money. It'll make them nervous a little bit, especially at the track. We have an 1/8 mile drag strip locally that I race at, and this thing, even though it's got a little bit of a tune on the stock engine, those 373s let this car keep up or even take the GTs at the drag strip, which is kind of neat to do. Not to mention, since I got into autocrossing in the past 3-4 years, this V6 has about 200 pounds less weight on the nose of the car, really evening out the weight distribution in the car. It's really nice to have that less weight up at the nose of the car. Even if you have a V6, it can be advantageous for you actually in an autocross situation. 200 pounds or so of less weight, not only in the engine, but in the transmission. This T5 is only 75 pounds, whereas say the GT's manual transmission is probably closer to 125 pounds. So you got that weight reduction, not only from less cylinders on the engine, and you don't have overhead cams or anything like that. This V6 is a pushrod engine, so there's a lot less weight there. So it's really handy for cornering, making this quite nimble, especially with this coilover setup I have on it and these big heavy-duty sway bars. Whoops! I didn't let my tires warm up. I got a little squirrely. But once they're warmed up, they got some great grip. This transmission, built by G-Force, has got some beefier gears in it. They're a wider gear, and they're still helical cut gears, but first through third, the helical cut is so shallow, it sounds like they're kind of a straight cut gear, the way they whine, especially first and second gear. So they're pretty noisy, but it doesn't matter when you're cruising, because when you're in fourth gear or you're in direct drive, you're not really dealing with any whiny gears. So it's nice and silent if it weren't for the rear end noise I'm hearing. Maybe I'll fix that one day. Well, as far as the autocross suspension goes, in the front I have, they're not super high spring rate. They're about 325 pound, and the rear is about 175. But that's enough to make a pretty rough ride, and I have some adjustable Coney shocks that really stiffen the ride up and get it good for autocross. So it's about right for how I use the car. Even with my shocks set on full soft ride right now, it's still pretty rough. You'll feel every bump. It's clunky. All the bushings are urethane versus rubber, except 2 of them on my lower control arms, which are a spherical bushing. Makes for a noisy, clunky ride, but man, this thing handles like it's on rails pretty good. And right now, my alignment specs, being a straight axle in the back, you can't align anything back there unless you induce some severe trauma to your axle tubes and bend them. There's no alignment to do on the back, but on the front, I have it pretty aggressive. The caster, I have it at about 5¼ degrees caster. So from the, let's say, the front driver's side of the car, they're angled back pretty good. More caster allows for more camber as you turn in. So the more you turn your wheel, the more camber you'll get, which is good for your cornering. On top of that, I have my static camber, where it's just sitting still. You're looking at the front of the car. You can tell my tires are tilted way in like this. I have it set at about -2.5 degrees, and that dramatically helped the cornering in itself too. But the big downside, if I'm just cruising like this, man, it really wears the insides of your tires down like nobody's business, especially if your toe is off a little bit. It's really gonna chew them up bad. But I don't drive this car all that much. I put maybe 2,000 miles a year on it, so I can handle that tire wear. In fact, I've had these tires on here 3-4 years, and they're still wearing pretty decent given the camber specs. And finally, the toe, I guess for just cruising, you want to have them towed in slightly. Like if you're looking straight down at the ground, my toes, or the camber, excuse me, the toe, it'll have the tires kind of pointed in towards each other on the front. Well, I have my toe currently set at 0 to where they're almost perfectly parallel. But in an autocross situation, it's actually better to have them towed out. That really improves your turn in, and if you get enough toe out, you can actually make this car that generally tends to understeer, you can make it oversteer if you want, which is kind of dangerous. So I just kind of put it where a 0 toe, just because it's good for just cruising in situations like this and taking it straight to the track and not have to worry about aligning it every time. Like between autocross season and winter, I just leave it all as it is. I have it dialed in where I want it. High caster, high camber, high negative camber, and 0 toe. The steering is really responsive, even though the steering is factory. It's pretty responsive. The car doesn't do the old turn the wheel and then the body legs. It's pretty good and tight. It's thanks to those spherical bushings. Well, excuse me. The back has spherical bushings. The front has urethane. But on the tie rod ends, those are spherical bushings, and that helped too. Let's drop a gear. 2 gears. great handling. But again, this is not stock, and it is a world of difference. Yeah, just a V6, but you don't need 8 cylinders to have fun in a car or get in trouble. As you see, not much for creature comforts in here. I mean, you got about air conditioning and that's more or less it. No nice materials. It is what it is. I mean, it's typical 90s American vehicle. What do you do? I mean, they focus more on the body styling than they did the interior. In fact, when they changed the body style in '99 to the more angular version of the SN95, which is the 94 to 98, which was more curvier body lines. Well, in '99, they just basically just kept the same interior. Didn't change it. As far as exhaust, I took off the single pipe exhaust and I put duals on, True duals. Well, first I put it into long tubes, which go to catalytic converters in an H pipe, 2.5 inch, and then it goes to a Borla. It's called an S type. They're kind of a glass pack type of muffler, but I like them because they're nice and mellow when you're cruising, but under load they can get kind of loud. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing given the engine, but it's got a pretty decent sound. I mean, with the V6, what do you expect? But it still makes a good tone. Still makes a good tone. All right. Particular tune has a nice cackle on diesel. I like that. It has some nice deep pops, like you're popping popcorn. Two and a half inch duals is it's quite big for a stock V6, but you know, with the 2.5 on it, it still does all right. The torque band is still good, usable. It's about right for when I'm drag racing and my RPMs are near red line, even though it's got a low red line of only like 5,200 RPMs. Well, not too much else to talk about as far as drivability. It is a fun car, and the thing about these new Edges is that there's tons of aftermarket parts, and there probably always will be, simply because it's a Mustang. Even the V6 engine itself, you can get parts for those all day. There's even several companies in North America and Canada that port the factory heads and put big valves in them. You can get cams with several different profiles on them. You can get high lift rockers. You can put the stroker crank in there to make it a 4.2 liter, like say out of an F-150. If you put high compression pistons in it, you can get, if you tune it right, you can probably get 300 horsepower on pump gas with a high compression 4.2 V6, which would be pretty sweet. So with that 200 pounds of weight off the nose, having 300 horse out of a V6, man, this thing would rip pretty dang good. I'd like to keep this a V6 car. It always has been. I've always enjoyed it. Yeah, it'd be cool to have a V8, but they're not necessary. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video of me just, you know, flapping my jaw about the new Edge, but yeah, with the right parts, they're pretty dang fun, and maybe even unsuspecting to some people. And even though the majority of them, minus the Cobras, are a straight axle suspension, you can get them to handle really dang well. Like I said, there's lots of aftermarket for these cars. If you're ever looking for a fun car, project car, I suggest 94 to 04 Mustang, but probably the 99 to 04 is the better of the two. So, go out and take one for a spin, or go riding one. They're quite fun. I appreciate you watching. Have a good one.